1 in 3 is intended for mature audiences. Episodes contain explicit content and may be triggering as they often include violence and other varying forms of abuse such as emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical. In most cases, names have been changed to protect all involved. Please note, statements and opinions of guests do not necessarily reflect those of my own. Hi, warriors. Welcome to 1 in 3. I'm your host, Ingrid. In episode 19, I chronicled the domestic violence story surrounding Nicole Addimando. Please revisit and familiarize yourself with it, as today I am honored to share a discussion I had with her sister, Michelle Horton. Michelle wrote a compelling memoir recounting the drama surrounding herself and her family as they navigated through learning of Nikki's abuse, her arrest, and sentencing. The book is titled Dear Sister, a Memoir of Secrets, Survival, and Unbreakable Bonds, and was just released January 30th, 2024. Here is Michelle.
Incredible research, and you hit all of the points that a lot of people don't hit. So I thought if I was going to talk to anyone, I would be happy to talk to you because I trust, the story in your hands. So my story is that 6 years ago, last September, I got a knock on the door, and it was a police officer saying that my niece and nephew, who were 2 and 4 at the time, were sitting at a police station, and my sister, Nikki, was there. And that's all that they could tell me. And from that point over, life kind of flipped on its head. And over the next few hours, reality unraveled, and I learned that my sister, who, was a preschool teacher and a stay-at-home mom and a person I trusted more than anyone on the planet, had shot her partner, someone who I had known for 9 years, who was part of our family, who I did not see as being violent or unsafe. And I had no context for why or even how at first. And I learned quite quickly that she had been involved in a domestic violence situation far beyond anything I could have ever comprehended or anticipated. And I was brought into a circle of women who had been trying to help her escape for years. I learned things about my sister, who was the closest person to me in proximity my entire life. She's 2 years younger than me. I thought I knew everything about her. And I was sitting in rooms with people who knew details that I never could have fathomed. I learned just how much I wasn't seeing right in front of me. And I had to make a decision whether I was going to believe her and believe this situation and take in my niece and nephew, or I guess I wasn't. I mean, there wasn't even really a choice. That's just the reality that was presented to me. And I said yes. And from that point on, me and a group of women, we started as a very small group, and we've grown large over the years. And we have never stopped fighting for people to see the injustice of what had happened to my sister before she had to pull a trigger to save her own life, and then how the court system responded. And so I have been raising her 2 children through all of this and, battling the criminal justice system, enduring a very high profile local murder trial, walking through a verdict, that was not what any of us ever saw happening. And just, riding the ups and downs along the way, like a lot of downs, and doing it with an incredible group of women who've become sisters to me. And, that was 6 years ago. We've been through a lot. And I wrote about the whole story. Before all of this happened, I was a writer, and I kind of always knew that this was a story that needed to be told, and not what happened to my sister, but what happened to me and our family as a result of how the criminal justice system criminalized her for her act of survival.
And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles with domestic violence victims when asked, why did you stay in this relationship? There's a feeling of, hopelessness because they hear of different situations of where the justice system failed. And I think there is another episode that I did 1 or 2 weeks after your sisters where the actual perpetrator had a lower sentence than what Nikki was initially served with. You mentioned in your author's note at the beginning of the book the reasons behind wanting to write the book. What would you like for listeners to this podcast to take away from your story?
Well, I think, first of all, I would love more people to understand the issue of criminalized survival, because before this happened to our family, when it first happened, I assumed it was just an anomaly, that this was just a crazy thing that happened to us and to Nikki. And I didn't understand that this is what happens to domestic violence victims who fight back, that there's a very real reason that victims don't believe that the system is going to keep them safe. Because like you said, perpetrators typically do not have very long prison sentences, and prisons are not a breeding ground to create more safe people. Like, those people then come out and are unsafe again. And victims are not wrong to not trust the system, as evidenced by how they ended up treating Nikki by not believing her. So that our women's prisons are filled with women who are victims of gender-based violence in all forms, whether they are like Nikki, they had to make a split-second survival instinct decision. It's not even a decision. It's just an instinct to protect your life. And the other person ends up injured or killed. It happens. I mean, domestic violence homicides happen every single day. 3 women are killed every single day in this country. And by sheer luck, sometimes women are able to survive. And when they do, they're put in the prison system. I really want readers to understand that, because, we are all taxpayers and we are all feeding into a system that feeds into the prison system. And we should know the truth about our women's prisons and the truth about domestic violence, and to pay attention to what's happening in our communities and pay attention to local elections, because it's the judges and the district attorneys that have all of the power in changing this situation. And I also would love readers to walk away with a sense that we as a community can also do a lot to support people. And there's a lot of hope and light in the form of people who step in these situations of injustice, and that there's a lot of good that can be done even in such a dark situation. And we have the power to survive and to be resilient in the face of unfathomable horror.
And I think that's a good point, too, that you mentioned a little bit earlier, is victims of domestic violence. There's a very thin line of the result of either getting out safely and surviving, or having to take the steps that your sister did. And again, not a choice, but an instinct. It's survive or not survive. Another point that I thought was important is how even family members may not be privy to what's happening in a victim's life. And I know I have a personal experience where my family had no idea what was going on. And it's not a direct result of not trusting the family. It's kind of an embarrassment or feeling ashamed of what's happening. How do you think your family handled that situation?
I think prior to, it all coming out very dramatically and undeniably, when it was able to be hidden, I think we reacted the way that most families do. I think, first of all, it's really hard to see something when you're too close up to it. It's hard to imagine that someone you know and love could really be hurting in the way that they are. It's like some kind of self-protective mechanism. I mean, I don't pretend to know the whole psychology behind it, but it's very real, and it happens to not just some families. It happens to most families when there comes to domestic violence. Domestic violence also happens to typically be generational. So we have our own blind spots and our own wounds that prevent us from seeing things from a full picture, because we might be projecting, we might be in denial about certain aspects of your own life. So I think it's really normal to not see what's right in front of you. And, I can't speak for Nikki, but I can say what she told me when the two of us would sit and kind of unravel this, how didn't I see this? Why didn't I tell you? Kind of conundrum that we were faced with is, like you said, there's a lot of shame and embarrassment, especially when it's sexual violence. That's not something you want to talk about with your parents or, your family. It's something that when there is sexual abuse, especially if it's rooted in childhood, as it was with her, that shame is really embedded in your entire worldview. So I could not fault her for wanting to keep that hidden. There's also the fact that there's someone in your life telling you no one will believe you. And there is a culture and a system that reinforces that at every turn. So it's not unreasonable to think that your family won't believe you. And what she told me was, if I said it out loud and I told you, the people that I care about the most in my life, then it becomes real. There's almost this ability to kind of sort of like deny, I don't know what the right word is for it, but to just like believe that it could go away, or believe maybe it's not as bad as I'm thinking it is, to kind of minimize it in her own head. But if she said it out loud to me or to her, our parents, then it's real and something is going to need to be done about it.
I think that's a very common belief because through the stories that I've read and researched and talked to with others, it's almost like when you say it out loud, you actually become the victim. You don't want to believe that you are an actual victim of domestic violence, but once it's said out loud and the people closest to you, especially family members, know about it, then all of a sudden you are a victim and you're sitting in a situation where you were trying to not be in, either believe that you weren't in or try to find a way to solve the problem. Because I think a lot of victims also feel that the reason they're being victimized is because of something that they did, or if they changed their behavior, they would be able to change the abuse. Did Nikki ever mention anything like that
Oh, yeah.
to you?
Yeah. I mean, that was really what she struggled with, from what I understand, talking to her former therapist, talking to her confidants at the time, was that this is something that kept happening to her since she was little. And so, which is very common. It's incredibly statistically common when you're a victim of violence to intimate partner or childhood abuse to be re-victimized. That's just like a statistical fact, but it's something that's hard for people to comprehend. And I know it was hard for her because she would say, well, this has happened to me more than once, and the common denominator is me. So I must be the one who's causing this to happen. And we live in a culture that victim blames. So, that is reinforced everywhere you look, that she must be doing something to cause this.
So speaking of victim blaming, I think that's another reason why victims of domestic violence don't come forward and don't press charges, is because they are slut shamed or they are questioned on what did you do to cause this violence onto yourself, or why have you even stayed in this situation for as long as you have?
Yes, I completely agree. And typically, if a victim is going to come out and say, this person has been abusing me, what that person will do is say, no, this was consensual. Like, no, I didn't. Like the spectrum of domestic violence is very wide. So, if you've read the book, what happened to Nikki is very extreme and very specific. So it wasn't unreasonable for her to think everyone would think it was consensual because of it was a sexual nature. And we want to believe that women are sluts. We want to believe, that's just like part of our societal view. So when he's saying to her, I'm going to say it's consensual, I'm going to say, actually, this is your doing. That's humiliating to have to put that out there and to have to risk that. But then in her case, he wasn't here anymore. And that still was what happened. It was just the state was speaking for him.
Another aspect is legitimate fear. So if a victim were to file for a restraining order and actually get a restraining order, which is difficult in and of itself, but what does that piece of paper even do for the victim? How does that stop the perpetrator from actually escalating? Because now there's, a file on them and on their behavior. So they always say statistically the worst or the scariest part of a victim's situation is when they make it known that they're trying to leave.
Yeah, that's when most women are killed, is when they're attempting to leave or after they have just left. And that was the case with Nikki, was that she was trying to leave. And as she was trying to leave, the violence was escalating to severely homicidal levels. But, I had just ended a marriage about a year before my sister's arrest. And I did it with the help of a domestic violence agency, and I got a restraining order. And the courts kind of used that. They didn't kind of, they absolutely used that in court to say, well, your sister was able to do this. And you helped her, you told her to get a restraining order, but then like you didn't do that. So clearly that means you're not a real victim. Like that was kind of like, well, even your sister got a restraining order. I had financial abuse. I had emotion. Like it was not, I never once feared that me going and getting a restraining order was going to impact my physical safety. It's a very different situation to someone who has threatened and had proven to be very physically violent and has a weapon and has used that weapon on you before. I mean, it's a completely different situation. The fear level of if I take this step and get a restraining order, I'm actually at risk of dying. And there's another story of a local woman. This was, I think, a couple of years ago, where a woman left her abuser. She got a restraining order. She did everything she was supposed to do. The restraining order was violated multiple times. So the guy is in prison in our local jail, the same jail that held Nikki. And he was seen before a judge, the same judge that sentenced Nikki. And that judge let him out on electronic monitoring. He took off his electronic monitoring, the same kind of ankle bracelet that held Nikki when she was, out on bail, took off the ankle monitor, went to this woman's adult daughter's house and murdered her in front of the woman's grandchild, and took, the most precious thing he could from his victim, her daughter. And she can't get her daughter back. And, now the guy is in prison for the rest of his life, and, they call that justice. But there were so many times where that piece of paper did absolutely nothing to protect her, took her daughter, and her daughter actually tried to get a restraining order against this guy, and they denied her. And so the mother, this grieving mother now, who has had this horrific experience with domestic violence and her daughter being taken, and she's raising her grandson, is trying to fight for a law that family members can get restraining orders. And it's like, how is that not a thing already, that we should be granting protection to family members of victims when we know abusers will attack anyone to get at the victim? So, so all in all, restraining orders are not foolproof in helping anything, and often does escalate things. And I wish that wasn't the case, but it is.
I think also in terms of escalation, it brings up another point of how people who are not familiar with the world of domestic violence often wonder how victims end up in that situation. And they'll even say, if that were me, I never would have put up with that. I would have been long gone. But domestic violence doesn't start with the level of severity that Nikki suffered from Chris. It starts off a lot more, can't say gentle, but at lower levels, maybe psychological or emotional abuse that ends up escalating into the degree of where it can lead to even to murder.
Yeah. I think that escalation is incredibly important for people to understand, because when it gets to a certain level, sometimes when it gets to a homicidal level, the system is not doing a really adequate job at all at figuring out how to prevent someone who has the power and control in a situation from taking somebody's life. When it gets to that level, like, it starts in one place and it escalates always, every single time. And where it escalates to might vary, and where it's interrupted can vary. But when you're trying to get out of it at step like 16, you're in a much more dangerous place than if you were trying to get out of it in step 1. So we just look at a situation and you're like, well, I wouldn't have allowed it to get to that level. But you don't understand how slowly it creeps in, and all of the other factors like children. I didn't know. I mean, so much about domestic violence I learned through people explaining to me my sister's story, like sitting in rooms and then me asking questions, like understanding how there was such a clear escalation with each birth of their children, and one particularly sharp increase during a pregnancy. And to me, I thought that was like, wouldn't they be nice during a pregnancy? Like, you're carrying the child. And I didn't know that statistically that is a factor of escalation, typically is during pregnancy. As like, I don't understand the psychology of that, but it is just truth that pregnancy can cause the abuser to escalate, and also keeps the victim more trapped because they have children to take care of. And sometimes they don't have the financial means to take care of those children without the abuser. It's just a really complicated situation. And it's just another thing that people need to understand. Like, the leading cause of death in pregnant women is homicide. That's just a fact.
That was one fact that I had read, and that took me by surprise too. I have learned a lot about domestic violence over this past year of doing this podcast, but that was one statistic that I didn't realize either, is how the amount of domestic violence increases with pregnancy. And that completely baffled my mind, that the leading cause of death in pregnant women is homicide. Speaking of laws, the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, that had just been passed. I know it coincided with, was it Nikki's sentencing?
Her verdict. So
Her verdict.
yeah, and it was like, it was such a factor in the entire decision. Her decision to go to trial was because we had been told, listen, like, there's this law that's about to be passed. Probably it took 10 years for this to get passed, which is a law that basically says if a victim of domestic violence commits a crime, then their sentence should be mitigated by the fact that they were a victim. Like, the judge should take into consideration that they were a victim and sentence them accordingly. Not saying like victims of domestic violence should not be incarcerated, which they shouldn't be, but it was just, we should consider, which again is just kind of insane that it's not already a law. But it took 10 years to get this to be passed. It had passed, I think, in the Assembly. It may have passed in the Senate, and we were waiting for at the time it was Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York to sign it into law. But we had no idea when it was going to happen. And so she ended up going to trial, did not go the way she wanted it to. And then I think maybe 2 weeks later, it was signed into law. And we kind of all felt like, oh my gosh, this was made for Nikki. Like, this is going to be the thing that's going to help her. So she had to go through an entire mini trial, like a 3-day trial again, to prove if she was a victim of domestic violence, which is another question entirely of how much proof do you need? What does the court need to prove that someone is a victim of domestic violence? It seems as though the standard of proof is unreachably high. Nikki had all of this evidence, all of these witnesses. And at the end of it all, the judge decided he did not believe she was a victim of domestic violence. So the law didn't work initially. And we all kind of went into a panic because how the law works is, how one judge decides a law is then cited by other laws and by other judges in other cases. So if Judge McLaughlin's ruling of Nikki, that she wasn't a victim, then that could affect how other victims are sentenced and seen under this law. So we really used that to fight in her appeal. And when her appeal was seen by higher court judges, they decided that she was a victim of domestic violence and did resentence her under the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. So if that law had never existed, and it's not a law that a lot of states have. More states are beginning to have laws like this, but it was a pretty progressive law for New York to have. If that law didn't exist, which if it had been just a few years prior, it wouldn't have, then she would have a 19 years to life sentence right now. But instead, she was sentenced to 7.5 years. So the law, it was a long road to get the law to work for her. And I felt guilty that, advocates had been fighting for this law for 10 years. And then in the swoop of one judge's decision, it could have made the entire law just worthless. But thankfully it did work. And because it worked from a higher court, I forget the number, but one of the lawyers who works on these DVSJA cases, it's dozens and dozens of women who have been released or will be released because of this law. So it's quite literally saving people's lives.
Okay, I was just about to ask if you were aware of how well this has worked since your sister's case. Her case was the first one to be considered. Is that correct? Or one of the first?
Yeah, one of the first. It was one of the first when it had first gotten signed into law, but then there were a couple of other cases that were decided one way or the other. I think the first, funny enough, the first one that actually worked was a man. The victim was a man. It's of course. Now, it's almost every day, not every day, but a lot I hear from Nikki saying oh, so-and-so got her DVSJA. She's packing up and leaving. And Nikki had a friend named Liz at Bedford another horrific story of survival. And she had spent years kind of languishing in the appeal process because there's not a lot of attorneys who are well-versed in this. And the attorneys that cost a lot of money. So, that's another issue, that there are a lot of women who are in prison who need to have someone fighting for them for the DVSJA. It's a whole process to go through the appeals process. But Liz reached out to me the other day and said, I got my DVSJA. I'm going home. And it's just such a good feeling that it's working. And I'm still very close with the woman. Her name is Kim Dadu. She was, I don't know if there's a documentary that Nikki was in called And So I Stayed. And it's about Nikki and it's about this woman, Kim, and another woman named Tanisha. And Kim started this law and has been fighting for it tirelessly. And it's just so heartening to see her work playing out because she served, I think, 17 years for killing her abuser. And she was I don't want another woman to go through what I did. So, it's remarkable to be connected to all of these people who are fighting for the right thing.
I think one thing throughout your book and watching that documentary and seeing the character of you and Nikki and your family is it's really amazing because as frustrating as her entire, all of it from Chris all the way through to currently, the result and everything, the fact that you guys are still advocating for other victims and happy for those who this law has worked for and their sentences have been shortened appropriately. I think it's amazing to see the excitement that is working for them still while Nikki is still serving out her sentence.
Yeah. Well, thank you. There's also a sense that one singular day spent in prison is too much. So there are moments where we're celebrating that a woman is getting out after 22 years. And it is wonderful because she's not there for the rest of her life, but that's 22 years that she's been locked away. And so it's kind of like both. It's excitement, and it's also just like grief that there's still so much life being lost to this very clear injustice that women, it's typically women, it could be anyone, you know, any gender of people who are facing gender-based violence, that are subjected to the abuse of the criminal justice system after surviving what they survived in their own house. It's wrong on so many levels.
Agreed. And it doesn't just affect that person, that individual. There are families and small children where the timeline that you would give of, it's been 18 months. That's such a huge, in any lifespan, that's a huge amount of time. But then when you're also talking about small children who are missing their mother, that's incredibly devastating.
Yeah. And that is one other thing that I would really hope people would take away from the book, is to see firsthand the effect that it has on children and people, because, people love their true crime stories and they love reading the news, and they kind of think it's like one person versus another person, and it's just the people who are in the defendant's seat or standing next to the prosecutor. But there's an entire network of people who are affected, most significantly children. And the experience of having a parent who is incarcerated, especially someone you're incredibly bonded to, your mother, and someone that you know to be good, like the cognitive dissonance of, this is my mom and I need her and she's good. She's the best person I know in the world, but the world is telling me that she's bad. I mean, that's just really psychologically very difficult. And the emotional toll that it takes on children and families, parents, siblings. I really wanted to convey that in a way that people could feel, because hopefully it would have them looking at these stories differently, that it's not just, one person and another person. It's entire family systems and what that does to generations of people.
Yes. And I think also by you telling your story, I think that's going to be so incredibly helpful, because Nikki you had a very good support system. You learned that as you were introduced to all these other women who were supportive in her life throughout the years. And then all of Kim's work getting this law passed. There's been an incredible amount of support, and you being as dedicated as you were to learn the legal system and learn all about domestic violence in order to help your sister is incredible. And the fact is, there's a lot of victims out there that don't have that support system. But I think by hearing these kind of stories, they may be able to kind of fall back on, I'm not the only person going through this. And if this person can get through, then I can get through as well.
Yeah, I hope so. And I hope that they understand that we need each other in this, that there are organizations that will put together defense committees if possible. The places where defense committees are successful, like we live 90 miles from New York City. Like, we're close to resources. We're close to large pockets of people. California, like our defense committee will sometimes like Zoom with other defense committees. Sometimes defense committees, they don't even know the person. They're just people who want to do the right thing and they're passionate about this and they want to help. I think the defense committees that are the most successful do have ties to the person, but anyone can do this work and we can do it together and we can work together. But there are some pockets of the country that they don't even have attorneys that are in the state that specialize in this, that even understand this. I mean, the fact that we are near so many resources, that's not because we were deserving of it or Nikki was deserving of it. It was just quite literally where we live. And there are just a lot of people don't have that privilege based on all sorts of reasons. And that's one thing that's been like a little hard for people to like process, that Nikki in a lot of ways was like a best case scenario as far as the people who were around her, the lawyer that we ended up finding in the end, the resources that were given, like the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell is a New York City based firm that came in for the appeal and gave like millions of dollars of pro bono work. That's like 1 in a million chance, like that doesn't happen to a lot of people. And we cannot continue to like just hope that someone's lucky enough to stumble into the right, resources. It's just, 7.5 years of her life is like a best case scenario for this issue of criminalized survival. And like, we have to do better than that.
Agreed. And I think that any victims, survivors, whatever you want to call it, the more they get involved, the more they tell their story, I think the more that is going to be able to happen. So 7.5 years from her sentencing, what timeline does that put her as far as her release?
Well, they don't like to give you specifics ever. The longest they can hold her is until summer, so July of 2024, which when we first got the news of the appeal was in 2021, which is kind of where the book ends. It felt like an eternity. It felt like, yes, incredible that she doesn't have a life sentence anymore, but we still have 3 more years of this. Like, this is like, it's a lot to have to move through, but we're kind of like here now. We did move through it. We're on the precipice of 2024. So we're really like preparing for her to come home. Like, our committee is like just yesterday, we're like creating wish lists, and I'm closing on a house soon. And like, we're really moving towards her actually coming home within the next few months. So, yeah, I think we won't know the specifics until right before, because they kind of like to keep you on your toes. They don't really like to give you any solid ground in any way. But yeah, we're in the home stretch, which is really surreal. And it's like, this is our last Christmas. This is our, everything is the last, which feels like we can get through this. It's almost like we're kind of not enjoying, we're not, this last time, but this little 4-person family that we've had, we've, gone through so much together, the pandemic together. And it's like, okay, well, this dynamic is actually going to end in the best way. We're going to have mom with us now. And I'm sure the transition is going to be like all transitions. It's going to be ups and downs. But like, the fact that she will be out of a correctional facility, we don't have to go to a correctional facility anymore. I mean, it's like, we're so excited.
I imagine that, like you said, 3 years is, and you broke down the number of days and the number of visits, and that had to feel like forever away. But I can imagine the excitement of it's actually coming. So also your book, I want to talk about that a little bit. That's due to be released in January of 2024.
Yes, January 30th.
Okay, and so are there any links or anything? Do you know where the book will be available for purchase?
Yeah, the book is available for pre-order anywhere, anywhere that you buy books, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Target, but and your local bookstores. My local bookstore, Oblong Books, it's in Rhinebeck, New York. They are doing a pre-order campaign for signed books. So if you order through Oblong, then you'll get a signed book.
Okay, your story and everything that you guys have done is absolutely incredible. And I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Is there anything else that you would like to, any parts that we didn't touch on that you wanted to mention, or is there any kind of lasting remarks that you want people to sit with?
I hope that if people read the book, I hope you read the book, because having the experience witnessed is really powerful. And so much of my experience through the court system has been a silencing. So to get certain things out there means a lot to me just in my own personal healing. And I also think this is a story that illuminates something much larger in our society that often goes unnoticed, sometimes in our own lives, definitely in our communities. And we all have this power to sister each other through the darkest moments of each other's lives. And it matters so much to show up for each other and to carry each other through these horrific experiences. And if there's anyone who is interested in learning more about criminalized survival, there's an organization called Survived and Punished. It's like the perfect name because that's exactly what happens. And they have chapters all over the country. They have a New York chapter that really guided us as a defense committee with even just language of what a defense committee does, how we can organize together. There's opportunities all over the country. There are survivors in prison all over the country that need support. They need people showing up for them. They need people sharing things on social media, being loud when, the families or the victims themselves cannot be loud in the public. They need other people to be those mouthpieces. Staying silent is the worst thing that we can do. So if there's anything you can do, it's just to use the power of your voice in any way, in any network that you have, and to just pay attention to what's going on around you and reach out to people.
So incredibly well said. Thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited for you to be reunited at home with Nikki and everything that the new year is going to bring to you and your family. Thank you so much for coming on today. Thank you so much for sharing your story through your memoir. And thank you for all the work that your family continues to do for domestic violence survivors.
Thank you. And thank you for taking my sister's case so seriously and reporting on it so thoughtfully. It really meant a lot to me when I heard your episode.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. All right, Michelle, seriously, thank you so much. I know this was difficult, and I know it's not your favorite thing to do, but I really do appreciate it. I think you have an amazing story and an amazing voice to share with everyone. So
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, Take care and good luck with everything.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye. And thank you for all the work that your family continues to do for domestic violence survivors.
Thank you. And thank you for taking my sister's case so seriously and reporting on it so thoughtfully. It really meant a lot to me when I heard your episode.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. All right, Michelle, seriously, thank you so much. I know this was difficult, and I know it's not your favorite thing to do, but I really do appreciate it. I think you have an amazing story and an amazing voice to share with everyone. So
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, take care and good luck with everything.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye. Once again, I wholeheartedly thank Michelle for sharing her story with us. I'm ecstatic to have seen an update that Nikki has been officially reunited with her family on January 4th this year. If you would like more information on Nikki and Michelle's story or the work they continue to do, please view Michelle's bio connected to this episode. A link to her bio, as well as the Vimeo documentary Michelle mentioned on Nikki, is included in the show notes. As Michelle stated, we are all together in this. Let's continue to use our voices and resources to help all affected by domestic violence. I will be back next week with another episode. Until then, stay strong, and wherever you are in your journey, always remember, you are not alone. Find more information, register as a guest, or leave a review by going to the website 1in3podcast.com. That's the number 1, IN, the number 3, podcast.com. Follow 1in3 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 1in3podcast. To help me out, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. 1 and 3 is a .5 Pinoy production. Music written and performed by Tim Crow.